You'll never know my answer.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Mr. Vasilash.
John, how are you?
I'm doing great. You too?
Absolutely.
Cool. Now, do you got something that you're going to throw at me that I'm going to tax my brain on?
All right. So basically, we're gonna talk about car sales.
Yeah.
And we're gonna talk about automotive history.
Yeah.
And so I've got something that sort of combines these two things.
Okay, let's hear it.
So now we had sales numbers came out last week when we didn't have a show. So
Right.
we'll get to some of those numbers. And one of those numbers was 470. Okay, 470.
470. Okay.
Okay. And it just so happens that on July 11th, 1899, a company was founded and it sold 470 vehicles in the United States in the first half of the year.
Wow, that's a lot.
470?
What, for that time?
No. This year they sold 470.
Oh, that's a bad number.
That's a very bad number. I was going to say we could park them outside in the lot over there.
If you had sold that many in 1899, that's a different story.
Yeah.
Not last year or this year.
So the name of the company was, and this is what I find to be most fascinating, Paul. What the translated name of the company is: Italian Automobiles Factory of Turin.
Fiat.
Who knew? So yeah, it's their anniversary today.
Fabbrica Industriale Automobile Torino, I think is.
Yeah, and I wouldn't try that. So I mean, it's just like, but yeah. So think about that. 1899.
Yeah, they've been around a long time.
Yeah, I wish they were doing better.
Well, they do well in Italy and South America, and that's about it.
Mm-hmm. And well might be well-ish nowadays.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
So on with the show.
Let's talk about who we've got here. We've got Rick Wainschel from a company called Cloud Theory. They're doing some fascinating stuff. We've also got Tim Jackson, who's written a book called Dude, Where's My Flying Car? We'll be getting into a lot more of that in the second half of the show, talking about VTOLs, vertical takeoff or landing vehicles, flying cars, in other words.
But first, okay, Rick, what is Cloud Theory? I mean, what is it that you guys do?
So Cloud Theory is a company, it's really a technology company and a marketing company and an insights company all rolled into one. So the basic premise of what we do is we collect information from the internet focused on dealer websites, and we index, just like Google does the entire internet, we index the information that's on those dealer websites, and we're able to gather, clean, organize, and visualize the entire inventory picture in the United States by looking at the inventory that's being marketed to and visible to consumers. And then we also have a metric that we've created that looks at vehicle movement. Vehicles, because we're collecting that data at the VIN level every day, we're able to see if vehicles have been removed from those websites as a proxy of sales. We've done a lot of work to vet that and correlate that, and it's a very high correlation. So basically what we do is we have a complete and real-time picture of supply and demand that's occurring in the marketplace today, and we've collected that information for 7 years. So we have a very wide-ranging history that goes back prior to the pandemic, through the inventory shortages, the inventory rebound, and we're able to look at this on the behalf of the OEMs to understand their current sales and supply dynamics that are occurring in the marketplace.
Well, an OEM knows what their current supply and demand is, right? You want to sell the information of what their competitors are doing.
That's correct. So, we talk to the OEMs every day, and they literally have a real-time view, well, in some cases up to the hour, of how many cars they've sold as they come to the end of the month. What they don't see, though, is Honda doesn't see Toyota doesn't see Ford. And so our information provides them that visibility to not only look at what they're seeing for themselves, but how it sits relative to their competition. Do they have a lot of inventory that is not selling very well. They therefore need to support those vehicles with higher incentives or more marketing support to boost demand, versus another part of the country where maybe they have a shortage of vehicles. They're selling very well compared to the competition and, relative to the competition in a given segment. And they're just subsidizing purchases with those incentives. So we're able to help them optimize their spend, optimize the way that they're going to market, and match demand with the supply that they have in the marketplace.
So you're doing this basically at the model level, or is it just an aggregate?
So we actually collected at the VIN level,
Okay.
and we're able to then aggregate that information up all the way to the industry level, but we can break it down by segment, by make, by model, by trim, by fuel type, by drivetrain. Really runs the gamut. We can even do it at the VIN level if someone wants to see it that way. And because we're collecting it from each dealer website, we also have complete visibility into the location where those vehicles are. That allows us to be able to say, you need to spend money in Chicago and not in Topeka, Kansas, because you have, a lot of vehicles there and not a lot there. So you need to support it appropriately.
So let me ask you. So in a recent release that you guys put out, you say that new vehicle inventory continues to slowly increase, hitting 2.93 million in the current month. New vehicle movement, on the other hand, has hit a plateau, sitting at 1.13 million. Okay, what is this new vehicle movement? And explain that.
Sure. So movement is, because we're collecting the data at the VIN level, we can see if a vehicle has been marketed and is visible to a consumer and then is not anymore. And we have enormous capabilities in terms of technology to ensure that it wasn't a dealer trade, it didn't show up somewhere else. So that vehicle was moved and is no longer visible to consumers. Now, as a proxy for sales, we've done an enormous amount of work to correlate looking backwards at registration information. We work with our OEM clients and partners to look at their sales, their very detailed sales, and match that to our movement numbers. And the correlation is in the mid to high 90s. So, and we do that for everybody. So it gives us the full and complete picture of that sales, so that it allows that OEM to see what they know what they're selling, but it allows them to see what everyone else is selling, how fast it's selling, how long it's sitting on the lot, what the turn rates are, what the days supply are, and so on. So all of those metrics are, cues as to how to do that allocation on the marketing and incentive side.
I got to believe electric cars is something that most automakers are very interested in getting this intel on.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that? Because the sales of electric cars are very region specific right now. And I got to believe they really want to make sure they're putting their inventory where it's going to do the best in terms of sales, but also keep an eye on the competition.
Absolutely. So in a macro sense, we track that, and you look at the, like, for example, the share of inventory, the share of supply versus that market share. And at the beginning of 2003, those lines split. And it was really caused by the regulatory pushes. All the OEMs were producing, trying to get footholds to meet the 2032 EPA standards that were coming. And what happened was they really, in a way, overproduced, and the demand did not come along for the ride. So now all of a sudden you have discounting that's going on, and to your point, there's regionality where there's some pockets where they're selling well, but in a lot of places around the country they were not, and the dealers are having problems to deal with that and the infrastructure associated with it. So we wrote that report really pointing to that oversupply situation and what it was causing in terms of that discounting. And we had a plan to revisit the EV topic once a year or so. And then we found, with the change in the regulatory picture that occurred in March, that now instead of a 67% EV target of production in 2032, that was relaxed to 35%. And PHEVs were a bigger proportion of where the industry needed to go. Now, all of a sudden, the competitive dynamic shifted greatly. So all the traditional OEMs that have very well-developed hybrid lineups, Toyota, for the most part, Toyota is very well developed there, but Hyundai, Ford, Honda, Stellantis, they were in a better position because they had a secondary path to meet these regulatory requirements. And now all of a sudden, Tesla and Rivian, which are, they have one path to follow. They're, in Tesla's case, they're the 800-pound gorilla of EVs, but they still only had one card to play because they can't go down the hybrid path. So it changed that competitive dynamic greatly. So we rewrote the report. We basically updated the report. And now what we're seeing is that hybrids are coming into favor. There's still a gap between the supply and demand on the EV side. There's too much supply for EVs because of that prior, overproduction. On the hybrid and PHEV side, that inventory position is increasing, but the demand is coming with it. And the demand is actually still outstripping the supply. So there is room for these traditional OEMs that have strong hybrid lineups to follow that path and have that secondary path for the meeting of those requirements in 2032.
i.e., they don't have to incentivize any of the sales of PHEVs or hybrids.
They do a little bit, but not as much as they do on the EV side for sure. And what it's also causing, and this is going to, I think, play out over time more and more, is you saw, for example, Ford pulling back, I think it was $12 billion worth of EV investment that they delayed. And GM announced that they were going to be getting back into the hybrid game. On the marketing side, you have brands like Ford that had the Your Vehicle, Your Choice campaign, where they're talking about, they have everything for everybody. So it just opens up the door to a different kind of conversation with the consumer. And the consumer is more comfortable with a tried and true technology like hybrids. It's not subject to the range anxiety that the EVs are. It's not subject to, am I going to be able to find a charge station? How long is it going to take me to recharge my vehicle and so on? And especially on the PHEV side, you've got the ability to market like what Lexus is doing right now, EV for short trips, the gas, it flips over to gas for the longer trips. So it's kind of the best of all worlds. It's still providing the fuel economy. It's still providing benefits to the environment, but it's doing it in a way that doesn't subject the consumer to the anxiety that they feel for the EVs.
So what are you seeing in terms of inventory for ICE vehicles? I mean, let's face it. EVs are sexy. Hybrids have become a useful tool. Let's describe it that way for consumers. But the good old ICE cars, I mean, what's happening with them?
So before I talk about that, just to mention on the hybrid side, the way we were talking about this is that the hybrids are in a way a bridge to the EV future, but in a way they're kind of a bridge to the present too, because of that interest, because of that supply demand balance in the favor of demand on the hybrid side. So there's, it's the here and now for the hybrids, but it's also that bridge to that EV future, because the OEMs will kind of figure out how to expand that EV range and so on. So it's less about the PHEVs. But to your question about the ICE vehicles, for all of the sexiness, like you were saying about the hybrids and the EVs and all the press that's available about that and the focus on it, the inventory of new vehicles right now is 80% ICE vehicles. So that is still the lion's share. It's down a little bit, about 4 points from a year ago. What's interesting is for all the press that's out there about EVs, that shift, that 4-point shift that went from 84 basically to 80% for ICE vehicles in the inventory position, about 2.5 points of that went to hybrids, and about 1 of those points went to EVs. So it gives you some view into what the dynamics of the market are. ICE vehicles are still dominant and will continue to be for a number of years, but that's really that kind of bridge to the present that we were talking about, is as consumers who want to move in that direction towards a more sustainably oriented vehicle, and they're interested in moving away from ICE vehicles, from gas powered vehicles, they're more apt to move to hybrids than they are to electrics.
Yeah. So, if you go back to the middle of the pandemic, car availability became so constrained.
Mhm.
Prices went through the roof. The car companies were making all kinds of money. And they said at the time, we've learned our lesson. We'll never overproduce again. And yet here, you're saying we're almost at 3 million units of inventory.
Mhm.
We're almost back to the same level where we were pre-COVID. How does this happen? I mean, and some brands, as have hit 100-day supply.
Yeah.
How do they let this get out of control?
Well, so a couple of things. So the pre-pandemic levels, just to frame this a little bit, right prior to the pandemic, the average new car inventory was at about 3.4, 3.5 million. At that time, the turn rates of those vehicles was about 30%, and the days to move, how long it took to sell a vehicle, was about 90 days. So here, comes the chip shortage and the supply chain issues and all that. And to your point, they were selling every car they'd get their hands on. Now we've been in this long recovery period, and this last month that we published our numbers, the new car vehicle inventory was 2.93 million. So we're not back to that 3.4, 3.5, but we're heading in that direction. The turn rates are at about 40%. The days to move are about 60 days. So not the 30% and the 90 days, but still, much more competitive than it was not too long ago.
But still, 90 days to turn. Tim, you used to work with or run the Colorado Dealers Association. I always heard the rule of thumb in the industry is if a car is sat on a lot for 3 months, the dealer can kiss his profit goodbye.
Absolutely, and they do to move it, to get it off the lot. And so obviously dealers are better off in the way the manufacturers were better off. Everybody in the industry was better off with that shorter supply, and they were hoping that that supply isn't pushed on them because it messes up the entire operation.
But to answer your basic question is, how do we get here? And if you think about it, we were looking at the new vehicle introductions that were occurring during the supply chain issues, and that really dried up. The only vehicles at the time that were being introduced were EVs, because the OEMs were focusing and concentrating on getting those vehicles out there and getting those footholds established. So you've got this kind of pent-up demand in terms of new vehicle refreshes, model year changeovers, new vehicle introductions, and so on. And the OEMs are always going to look in some way in a myopic view of what do they need to do to hit their numbers, their profitability, what do they need to accomplish? And they're not really looking on the long-term view of, well, I'm going to increase my inventory by, 500,000 or a couple 100,000 or whatever, but so is everybody else. So that myopic view leads to where we're heading. I do think that there has been somewhat of a lesson learned. I'm hoping that continues to play out. But if you think about it, prior to the pandemic, just to give you an idea, the average incentive level for a new vehicle was 11%. At the bottom,
11% of the MSRP.
11% of the value of the vehicle was the incentivization of it. At the bottom, when we had very few cars out there, that number was about 1.5% to 2%, and right now we're at about 7%. So again, we're not back to the 11. We're not back to the point of repeating those levels that we saw before, but 7 and on our way to 8 is higher than 2. It was not going to stay at 2, right?
Yeah.
Given the situation. But I do think that they're more conscious of it, but I do think that that myopia that they apply to their own decisions will eventually continue to push the inventories up, maybe a little more slowly than before, but it'll still go up a bit.
Some automakers do a much better job than others, as you well know. I mean, Toyota famously operates on fairly low day supply. I'll just say 24, 25 days seems to be it. Subaru, even less than that.
Yes.
Is it because they're that much more focused on keeping supply more in line with demand, and others are just trying to fill up the dealer's lot so whoever comes into the dealer gets whatever they want?
Well, so we have a metric that we created. It's called Inventory Efficiency Index, and it's basically a comparison between the market share of a make or a model within segment, or we can apply it in different ways. But the market share versus the inventory share. So if you think about it, if a manufacturer has 10% of the inventory out in the marketplace, all things being equal, that manufacturer should be selling 10% of the vehicles. So some manufacturers are more efficient than others. So that index that we created, so for example, Toyota's index is perennially above 200. And what that says is they're getting more than twice their fair share of sales given their inventory position in the market. Now, to your point, part of that is their supply philosophy. They tend to be a little lighter. Subaru is even more so, as you said. But there's also the fact that Toyota just has an inherent appeal to consumers. They don't have to work as hard to tell the story of those vehicles and the quality and value of those vehicles. So they kind of have the best of both worlds. So in our latest numbers and looking at the last 6-month trend, Toyota's been the leader for quite a while. Lexus is starting to rise through the ranks. But another manufacturer that's doing quite well in that index is actually General Motors. So 3 of their brands, except for Cadillac, are in our top 10 on that index, and Cadillac is 11th. So they're doing a good job of kind of maintaining that balance between supply and demand. Other manufacturers less so. So it's really kind of not a game, but it's really kind of it's that balancing act of how much to produce, how much to support that sale with marketing and incentives to ensure that efficiency, effectiveness stays true.
So much of what you've been describing is what I would describe as being tactical. This allows them to make moves and to do things in the market in real time. To what extent is your information valuable for people to be able to make predictions of what they ought to be doing, types of vehicles that they ought to be producing or developing?
So there's certainly an aspect of what we do that is more tactical. And it's because we have that real-time information. We do a 30-day forecast of vehicle sales based on inventory positions and turn rates and the trends that we're seeing in those. So there's certainly an aspect of what we do that is allowing and enabling those decisions to be made about how to allocate money and where to put it regionally and that sort of a thing. But there's also, if you look at that macro picture, like what we were talking about from the incentive standpoint, the rise of inventory and the plateauing of demand and so on, we do those same sorts of things at a segment level or at a fuel type level or at a drivetrain level or at a trim level. So from a more strategic, longer term position, we're able to say, what's happening. So I'll give you an example. The top 2 segments in terms of our inventory efficiency index are mid-size sedans and small sedans. And, why is that? Well, there's been a lot of push and focus, especially still coming out of the supply chain issues, that the OEMs focused more attention on trucks and SUVs. They're more higher profit. They're, easier to sell in this marketplace. And in many cases, they either deprioritized or discontinued sedans. So now you have this sort of shortage of sedans, and the ones that are still existent are selling pretty well. So from the standpoint of like a bigger strategic standpoint, manufacturers have the ability to maybe try to corner the market a little bit and be a little more aggressive in producing sedans to meet that demand that's there because their competition is pulling back. So that's the beauty of this data is an OEM can look at that and say, well, we're doing this, we're making these decisions, but really what's the competition doing and what does that allow me to see in the marketplace and act upon accordingly?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to get your thoughts on Tesla too, because, if you go back a few years ago, it was build to order. They would only build a car once somebody ordered it. now it looks to me like they're just building cars, because there's a big gap between what they've produced and what they've delivered. And what's your views on their inventory?
So Tesla is actually an interesting one because they play things very close to the vest. There's not a lot of information that they release. To your point, they started this this kind of trend. It used to be that on the first or second of every month, each OEM would report their sales, and it would be big news and so on. Well, Tesla didn't play that game. They reported deliveries. They now only do that quarterly, and you're seeing some of the OEMs follow suit. So Tesla's an interesting one because, a delivery isn't a sale. A delivery is a reflection of the production and what they are pushing out into the market, but it's not a reflection of what someone is buying. And I think, my surmising of this is they're having to take discounts that triggered a lot of the other discounts that the traditional OEMs that were pursuing EVs had to follow suit. So, Tesla doesn't want to offer discounts. They want to make more money for every vehicle they want to sell, but they had to do that. And I think that's because their delivery number was outpacing their actual sales number. So, I think Tesla is going to be around. Tesla is going to be a big player and a big part of the future of this industry. But, what I was saying before about hybrids and everything else in the regulatory picture, they're going to have a little tougher of a road to hoe than they had, not too long ago.
One of the things I was sort of wondering about is we, as I mentioned earlier, we had sales reports, and it was surprising to me, and maybe to you guys as well. For the first half of the year, Ram pickup sales down 20%. F-Series down 8%. Now Silverado was up 4.8%, but still, did anybody in Dearborn imagine that there would be a fall off in sales of F-150s? I mean, I can't picture that.
This was first half of the year, you were
First
saying?
half, yeah.
So one thing about F-150s is a very interesting little case study of our numbers. Because we collect the data at the VIN level, because we're able to look at model year, for example, Ford got a very late start on their model year changeover from the 2023s to the 2024s. And so they, I think it was in March and April, only about 40% of their vehicles were 2024 model year. Meanwhile, the Sierra, the Tundra, the Silverado, and so on, they had a much smoother MICO. And so that really hurt Ford because they were having to discount the 2023s to make room for the 2024s, but the 2024s weren't being produced at the level that to replace the 2023s. So that hurt them. And it actually helped Chevy and GMC. Now Ram is a little bit of a different story. Ram has some, kind of challenges in a lot of different ways. In certain parts of the country, they're doing quite well, but generally speaking, they're still a bit of a challenger brand in that segment. But that really helps to explain the F-150 picture and why Ford was, really kind of struggling at the beginning part of the year. They've since righted the ship more, and they've gone through that MICO for the most part. They still have some 2023s out there. Here we are in July. But, 3-4 months ago, it was a much different picture.
So in other words, people in Dearborn didn't know that was happening. They just...
But isn't some of that too the fact that Ram had so much increase in sales and pressure on the General Motors brands and even Ford? They were getting so much closer over the past few years, and so the higher they get, the harder they fall.
Well, to that point, we were looking at like turn rate trends, for example, and at the time when Ford was having those struggles with their inventory position, Ram actually caught them in terms of turn rate. Their inventory position wasn't strong enough to allow them to outsell them, but they were at least turning the vehicles as quickly as Ford was. Again, that dynamic, that's why we look at this on a real-time basis, on a regular, trended basis, because that circumstance and that dynamic shifted once they got their MICO back on track. But certainly, yeah, there's all those interactive dynamics that occur between makes and models and segments and all that. So,
And it was mentioned that sedan production is some brands hardly have any sedans left. I mean, Ford doesn't have much, and you probably saw reported on that Nissan's now eliminating all of them, I think, except the Sentra, which is a big surprise. They've been big on sedans for a long time.
What's also interesting is the sedans are typically on the lower side of the market in terms of pricing, and that's been true not only on the sedan side of it, but also on the SUV side. So I was talking to someone this morning about the Chevrolet Trax, and that vehicle's price point is in the mid 20,000s, and Chevy's doing quite well with that vehicle. And part of it, I think, is it's a nice vehicle for its price point, but part of it is that the pandemic and the chip shortage and the supply chain issues kind of forced the hands of the OEMs to focus on those higher profit vehicles at the expense of those lower end ones. So now you have, back to your question about tactical versus strategic, if you're an OEM and you're playing that game, selling $60,000 trucks, there's actually room in the market to, do quite well on the $25,000 to $35,000 SUVs or sedans, and move in that direction from a strategic standpoint. So, the market is ever changing. It's always interesting, and there's always opportunity if you look for it and you find it.
Well, good. We should probably take a quick commercial break right now. Look, it's been fascinating. It's amazing how much information you can get by tracking inventory. That what a valuable tool, and amazing that you can even get that kind of data down to the VIN level.
We work hard at doing that, and half the game is collecting it, and that's hard enough to do that. The other half of it is making sense out of it, curating it, organizing it, cleaning it, organizing it, visualizing it, and making sense of it, and consulting with the OEMs. But we do that too. So it's kind of the best of all worlds.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks for that, Rick. We're going to take a quick commercial break right now. Give a shout out to our good friends at Bridgestone.
When the peace and quiet of your morning commute is as comforting as your morning macchiato, that's what really matters. Bridgestone Turanza EV tires. Less noise for more quiet comfort.
All right, we're back talking all things automotive. But now we're going to go a little bit beyond pure cars and everything, because Tim Jackson's written a book here called, why don't you hold the book up?
Sure.
Called Dude, Where's My Flying Car?
Just out. It's doing very well.
So, I mean, every time I talk about VTOLs, because that's the official name, vertical takeoff or landing, don't call them drones in front of the people who make VTOLs. They don't like that. They want to call them VTOLs. But anytime I talk about that, the topic of the Jetsons TV cartoon from the 1960s always comes up. It's unbelievable to me. Even it gets raised by people who weren't even born then that seem to be aware of it. But where do we stand right now, Tim?
Well, and you
VTOLs, they going to happen or no?
They're going to happen. The Jetsons, by the way, was on in the early 60s and 28 episodes on ABC. All the technologies on the Jetsons has come to fruition, except for the flying car. So if we can get across this bridge, we've completed the Jetsons. And now there's a Jetson VTOL coming to market. It's a personal VTOL. You could land it in your driveway, park it in your garage, and you want to take it to the mountains or to the beach, you could throw it in the back of your F-150 or your Ram and save some of the battery range. It's a pretty impressive vehicle. It's got range, a distance range of about 100 miles and a speed capacity of about 60 to 70 miles per hour. And it's coming in at $98,000. I want one of them, by the way. It's not the only one I want, but I want one of them.
So isn't it correct that it's eVTOL rather than just VTOL? I mean, VTOLs have been, around for a very long time.
Actually, yes, it is. And because they're all electric. But the manufacturers you talking about, they don't want to be compared to drones or called drones, but they also want to make sure you put the E in there. When I had the book written and I passed one chapter on to one of the one of the leading VTOL companies, and they said, you really need to add E on that. And I said, well, I said in the front that they're all electric, so that's already stated, but they specific. So I went back and added the lowercase e to all of them. But yeah, they're very sensitive to that. And I think that's one of the reasons that the aircraft manufacturers and the airlines are really excited about these, because they're all battery electric. So there's zero emissions when they're in the air, depending on the source, whether they're actually zero. But because they haven't been able to figure out the emissions game, as well as the automotive sector on cars. So the long haul jets, you can't power those by batteries. We never will be able to, but they're looking to basically bend the curve on their fuel economy with the help of battery electric VTOLs.
So, the whole premise is there's so much congestion, especially in big cities and the like. Instead of taking an hour to get to the airport, you get there in 10 minutes using an eVTOL. I mean, where do you see this really catching on? And is it just for super wealthy people, or is it going to get down into the masses?
All good questions. And these are the questions really that I've been dealing with. When I started the book, I didn't anticipate it was going to be all about flying cars. And it became just the 22 chapters of the 90 are about that. But I've moved from a skeptic to a believer. And I've moved from the basic question of if this is going to happen to the more immediate question of when. And here's what's moved me. It's where the money's coming from and where the investments are coming from. And it's three distinct pockets that are heavily investing in these. And we know them all, but they haven't traditionally, not that there aren't some exceptions, but they haven't traditionally worked together. Two of them have, one of them hasn't. One is the aircraft manufacturers like Boeing, Airbus, Bell Helicopter, and Embraer out of Brazil. All either have their own programs or are heavily investing in others, or both. The second is airlines like United, Delta, American, and JetBlue are all invested. And United is invested in three, not one, but three. And then the automakers. And they've taken different approaches. Some are wholly in-house, like Hyundai or Honda, but some are more external, like Toyota, Mercedes, BMW, VW, and others. So, and then they're investing in across platforms into the same VTOL companies. And so they're just like in the early days of the automotive industry, when bicycles were really precursors to cars, motorcycles, small planes, and the automotive industry. The drones really are the precursor. The drone technology has come a long ways, and we're doing, as a society, we're fulfilling a lot of important missions with drones. And when you think about them, they're all autonomous. There's not pilots up in those drones. That 4th of July drone show that I saw and many Americans saw, 300 to 500, in some cases 2,000 to 3,000 drones interacting together. They're all doing it autonomously through technology, and not just a snapshot frame, but moving, like the Year of the Dragon, moving dragons or moving flags. And so I'm often asked in presentations, if we put our traffic congestion that John cited on our roads, and we all recognize it, especially in metro areas, and we take it to the skies, are we going to fill the skies, and aren't we going to have traffic congestion? Not in our lifetimes, because because you got lateral and vertical, so and no shoulders, no ditches.
But okay, so going back to George Jetson. Okay, so he used his vehicle to go to Spacely Sprockets to go to work on a daily basis, right? Are you talking about John having his own vehicle, or are you talking about, for the foreseeable future, this being a service in order to get from downtown Manhattan to LaGuardia?
Yes, I mean, I hope John and you, Gary, and I and Rick, and we can all have our own. And I already said I want one. I actually want one for Monday, one for Tuesday, one for Wednesday, and a garage full of flying cars. But I think the first ones we'll see, and where it will become more accepted and believable, will be in the technical name is, we got a new name for everything, but it's urban air mobility, but the slang would be flying taxis. Now it's so far along that these top three companies, and let's get those on the table: Archer Aviation, and these are all based in Silicon Valley. By the way, Silicon Valley is the Detroit for flying cars. It's a Detroit for flying Motor City. Archer Aviation, which is invested in by Boeing and United Airlines and Stellantis, and they're probably arguably ahead of everybody right now. And so they're contracting. They were at a VTOL conference in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, and while they were there, they contracted with the city of Abu Dhabi to provide urban air mobility. But starting in 2026, they've got about a 6-year exclusive on it, and about 2 weeks after that, or let's say a month after that, they rolled out plans for urban air mobility around San Francisco Bay. And for those viewers who know that area, they already know where they're going to land them and take off in vertiports in communities like Liverpool, Oakland, San Jose, up to Napa, where I was at a conference yesterday.
Or probably
And-
Livermore, not Liverpool.
Oh, I'm
right?
sorry, Livermore. Thanks for that correction. Good correction. Livermore, and then in the Oyster Point in San Francisco Bay. I drove out to it last night before I took my rental car back. Took some nighttime photos of it. It's fascinating. But they will do urban air mobility, and that's that Oyster Point is very close to San Francisco Airport. So presumably that's where they plan to bring people in and then take them off in a van or a shuttle or a light rail over to the airport. It's about a mile away.
Okay, that's Archer.
That's Archer.
Or
Joby,
next
well, Joby was at the same conference, Joby Aviation, which is also headquartered in Silicon Valley. Fascinating company. And they didn't come out of Uber Elevate, but they bought the assets of Uber Elevate. Uber's plan to go urban air mobility. So they just signed a contract with the city of Dubai, not to be outdone by Abu Dhabi, to provide urban air mobility in Dubai starting in 2026. And I found this fascinating. Joby immediately follows it with a statement, well, we're committed to 2026, but we all actually want to start next year. And by the way, Joby is invested in by Boeing and Toyota and Delta Airlines. And they've already determined where they're going to build them. And that's as a nod to Orville and Wilbur Wright. It'll be Dayton, Ohio. They've got the land and they're ready to build. They're ready to build a factory. Toyota has so much invested that Toyota has a seat on their board and staffing in the design studios.
Didn't I believe that Toyota got involved with the company basically to provide it with knowledge regarding manufacturing processes,
I
and
think
then
so.
got
Yeah.
more and more engaged it and said this is something that
Right.
is
And I
useful.
think they also see that Hyundai and Honda and others have their programs, so they want to have a stake in that game.
Did they also? I was thinking that perhaps they learned something from the autonomous side. You were talking about the autonomous aspect of these flying vehicles. The OEMs are still trying to figure out, whether it's radar and all the telemetry and everything to do autonomous vehicles. Are they doing that in part to gather information on the autonomous side to help them on the traditional vehicles, or do you think that it's more about like getting into that flying car game?
I think it's too complete, and then not that some of that won't interact and interchange and benefit them over the long haul, but I think they're coming at it from its own urban air mobility standpoint, and all John and I talked earlier. This AI thing is just there's so much coming in the lidar and radar and things like that. So all of that will benefit. I think it'll benefit each other, but I'm not sure that's why they're in the game.
Okay.
And then, by the way, and we mentioned where Joby's going to build. Archer has their location to build with Stellantis. Stellantis is advising and helping, and that's in Covington, Georgia. It's a suburban community just outside of Atlanta, and it's already framed in. The building, I've got pictures of it, and maybe you have them on here. But they told me on Monday when I was at Archer headquarters and in a visit, my second visit there, I said, when do you think you'll be finished with the building? And they said by the end of the year. And I said, it'll probably take you about a year to become operational. He said, no, probably about 4 months. And then just this morning, they're saying that they think they'll be finished with the building in September.
Yeah.
So everything's moving up. And they plan to build, I think the only delay on this is to do all this urban air mobility in places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and San Francisco Bay and New York and Chicago and other places, they've got to have the vehicles to do it. So they're talking onesies and twosies now. So they've got to multiply them over and over. And the factory in Covington, Georgia is supposed to, when it's at full scale, they said they'll be building about 650 a year. So it's going to take a while to get out. If these things are as busy as I anticipate, it'll take a while for them to get out.
650 is very close to the 470 number
Yeah,
you were
right.
talking about Fiat. So
Right. So
Stellantis will be familiar with that number. So it's just
you told us two of your favorites.
Okay, thank
Joby
you.
and Archer, and the third
Segue.
favorite.
Whis Arrow. Whis Arrow started out as a project funded by Larry Page, co-founder of Google, who also funded Waymo, the autonomous car company. But it was called Kitty Hawk as a nod to Orville and Wilbur Wright. And Kitty Hawk, they put it to bed, but a division of Kitty Hawk was called Whisk Arrow, W-I-S-K, Arrow. And now it's been wholly purchased and operated now by Boeing. So it's a division of Boeing, but it has its own CEO, a guy by the name of Brian Utko, a fascinating individual. He's a PhD engineer. And the Whisk, the one distinction that Whisk has among the industry right now is those are being built with zero pilot controls. So they want to be autonomous from the start. And China's in this game. China had VTOLs, eVTOLs over at that same Abu Dhabi conference, and they were taking people up in demonstration flights autonomously in Abu Dhabi. So China, you could say, is right on our heels. I really think
It's a race between the U.S. and China.
It
Who's
is.
going to dominate?
just like
this?
cars. And by the way, on that subject, I couldn't find a map of where all these companies are at, so I created one. It's not in the book, but it's in my presentations, and it looks very distinctly like an automotive industry map. It's heavy in U.S., in China, in Asia in general, so Japan and South Korea, and of course Europe.
so you mentioned the assets of what was it called, Uber?
Uber Elevate.
Elevate, right? And they were purchased, but at one point, Hyundai and Uber Elevate were partnered, and this was before SuperNull came to existence. And so I look at this and think to myself, well, why couldn't Uber do this?
Right. And you mentioned Gary mentioned SuperNull. I think it's they corrected me on it and called it Supernal. Supernal. And
What is Supernal?
Yeah, but Supernal. I saw John and some of us were out when it was unveiled at the CES in early January this year. It's a fascinating vehicle, fascinating concept, and they've got that staff.
This is the Hyundai.
This is
VTOL,
Hyundai
eVTOL.
Yeah, Hyundai eVTOL called Supernal.
Yeah.
And but it's a whole in-house project, so they don't have partners of airlines and aircraft makers. It's just Hyundai is building it, but they've brought on tremendous talent to help them do that.
What you're talking about, Tim, here is why I really welcomed you on the show, because there's such an automotive tie-in to this. This is not just something coming out of the aerospace industry. I mean, you mentioned all the different automakers that are interested in it. And I think part of what's going on here is they're electric and they're autonomous. So there's this idea that these car companies get into a whole new area of business, leveraging what they've got to do with their cars anyway, so that they can bring in electric motors and batteries and inverters and autonomous sensors and the software stack that goes with that and whatnot, so that they could have a leg up on the aerospace companies, because the automotive companies are going to have so much more economy of scale in this.
I think you're right. And I came to this through the fascination of it. I am a private pilot. I got my pilot's license at age 19. I've done a lot of presentations on it, 70 so far this year. I can tell you that everybody's fascinated by it, because if you drive a car on congested roads and you say this might be a solution to that, they're fascinated by it. Or if you go to the airport and you're stuck in traffic when you're trying to meet the departure time, you're fascinated by it. But then I stayed because of the fascination of this interaction of these industries, and I think everybody has each of these industries have things to gain. The aircraft industry, frankly, is way ahead of the automotive industry on safety. For all the criticism of Boeing, and I'm not saying some of it's not justified, there hasn't been, by Boeing or Airbus or any of the aircraft manufacturers, a air fatality, an commercial aviation fatality in the U.S. since 2009, and yet there are 42,000 fatalities in traffic incidents on American roads each year. So the automotive industry, if we can get to zero fatalities by taking our cars to the air, let's do it. And then aviation has been ahead of automotive in fatalities and safety, but automotive has been way ahead of aviation in emissions. Vehicle emissions on the particle emissions are off 99%, down 99%. That's to be distinctive here. That's the brown cloud emitting, ozone enhancing, asthma inducing emissions. They're basically, even ICE engines, even internal combustion engines, are emission free. You can park your car in the garage and leave the engine running, and you don't have to worry about a fatality in the garage. But aviation hasn't figured out a way to do that, and this will, just like electric cars are helping automakers on the average fuel economy, this will help out the aviation industry on emissions, just the curve. So everybody's got something to gain, and let's don't miss this part. Society has a lot to gain. Society has a lot to gain because these eVTOLs, flying cars, passenger drones, whatever you want to call them, and I think all of them apply, if done right and done safely and accurately, they are a piece of the answer to traffic congestion, traffic fatalities, vehicle emissions, and something we all have to, everything comes down to time and money, right? So on the time that it takes to get from point A to point B, these are, as John indicated, these are fantastic at reducing the time.
Where do we stand with air traffic control? Because these VTOLs are not going to be able to use the commercial air traffic control, and yet we can't just let them go willy-nilly into the air because some of them will crash into each other. And I know that there was a lot of work being done by the FAA on developing a new air traffic control system just for these eVTOLs, but where does it stand?
Well, there was a bill just passed the U.S. Congress, and it was delayed for quite a while. It was supposed to pass in the last 2 or 3 years, but it did get passed about 6 weeks ago, and it has components in that legislation to help guide both non-passenger drones and VTOLs, passenger drones, if you will, or flying cars, and the other countries like United Arab Emirates, for example, they're completely relying on the FAA regs to guide it. There's two regulatory bodies. One's the European body, and one's FAA. But I sat next to a compliance officer with the FAA at a VTOL conference, or it was actually, to be fair, it was U.S. Chamber of Commerce Aeronautics and Aviation Summit in Washington, D.C. in last September. And so I just kind of leaned in during a break and I said, I bet there's a lot of pressure on you to figure out the regs on this. And, he acknowledged there was, but he said, we're going to get it right. We're going to do it right, but we're going to make it happen. We're going to help make it happen. There's going to be tremendous pressure on this competition between China and the U.S. The U.S. is not going to we're not going to be able to let China get way ahead of us on this.
So you mentioned that these companies are based in Silicon Valley. How do the people there feel about these things being referred to as flying cars?
I don't know.
Tech bros wouldn't be all that excited about that.
Just on the population, and not to just take Silicon Valley, but what I find in my presentations around that I've done, these 70 or so, is that I'm going to go out on a limb and say 99% of the public. I'm glad you're doing this show because your audience is much more attuned. I've watched this show and I see the engagement on YouTube, and some of your people that watch are really smart and really heavily engaged. But I think that 99% of the public, the general population of the U.S. at 330 million people, are oblivious to what's going on. Totally oblivious. And in fact, I find that when I have pilots in the audience, they're fascinated by it, but they don't know about it. I was on a red-eye flight out of Silicon Valley or out of San Francisco to get here from a conference in Napa Valley yesterday, and last night as before we took off in a 777 on a red-eye, I gave the pilot and the first officer autographed copies of the book. And I said, did you know this was going on? Did you know Boeing is involved in this? You're flying a Boeing plane here. Did you know United's involved in this? You're flying a United aircraft. And they didn't know. And most of them don't know. But when you talk to them about the technology, and your viewers should know that these 737s, 767s, 787s will almost fly themselves. You know, I asked a pilot one time, do you even need to get on today? Wouldn't this plane get us there without you? Oh, yeah, it would. But those people standing behind you waiting to get on, they're not going to get on and go if I'm not on board with you. So there's still a trust factor. And I think that's where the pilot comes in, is that trust factor. But yeah, I had in Phoenix at the Biltmore in January, I had a Air Canada retired pilot that I took to the meeting with me. He wanted to see it. And the president of the group that we were speaking to was a retired United pilot. And they hung around. I talked to him for 45 minutes after the presentation. And they both said, oh, yeah, this autonomous, I see it happening. Yeah, if they have the same technology that our Boeing aircraft have, they'll stay apart. They can do this.
These guys were retired. They don't care.
Yeah. So when do you, I mean, there's demo projects going on right now. I think the Paris Olympics are going to have some VTOLs. The Olympics go to Los Angeles in 2028. I know the plan was to move a lot of the athletes around that way because of congestion there. But what's your crystal ball here? When do you think the general public will become more aware of these things because they start seeing them fly in the sky?
I do. And when the public when they see it, and because then it becomes a news story. You know, the Abu Dhabi story that I mentioned in Dubai and the San Francisco Bay, it was in a pocket of local media, but San Francisco Chronicle, I found it, but I don't see it like in the major media, like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and all that yet. I mean, I'm not saying they haven't done anything on it, but it's not been a big story for them. I think when it becomes systematic, when it becomes available.
When will it be commercial? When will I be able to go to a skyscraper in Manhattan and take an eVTOL to Newark or LaGuardia or JFK?
That's the $64 billion question. And just like I said, Joby moved it up. We want to be able to do this in 2025. And by the way, I left out Whis on one of these local projects. Whis Arrow on the autonomous unit owned by Boeing just signed contracts with Sugar Land Airport, a metro airport outside of Houston, to do urban air mobility from there into Houston Hobby, Houston George Bush, and Houston downtown. So when that happens, and they said by 2030 on that one, but when that starts happening, and by the way, at this conference in Napa Valley, I talked to my counterpart from Houston. I said, did you know this was going on? He was oblivious to it. So right now, until it starts happening, I think most of the public will be oblivious to it. You mentioned affordability, or somebody asked about, will it be just for the rich or whatever? No, the cost of operation on these eVTOLs, and I've heard from two different economists presentations on this, is only about $350 per mile. So the
$350 a mile.
$3.50 a mile.
$350.
$350. It's like a car. I mean, so less. I mean, a little more than a car.
Yeah, but about 3 times or more than a car.
But take the car model and Uber and Lyft model. Most of the times they're going to the airport with one passenger in the back seat, and a deductibility rate of 60 cents or 65 cents a mile. So they're going to fill all the seats. There's not many seats in these. There's 4 in most of them, 5 in some, and do it for $350 a mile. But keep in mind that the distance is a lot shorter, because they're flying the way the crow flies.
So basically, we should make it clear that what these guys are working on right now is basically a shuttle service that goes between point A, point B repeatedly, versus John walking out to the parking lot and going to downtown Detroit in a flying vehicle. I mean, that's not happening
No,
the
and that's a good
foreseeable
point.
future.
That's a really good point, because on those 650, it's not like 650. It's not like the 470 cars that are going to individual owners. These are going to be vehicles that will be used probably around the clock, or at least 18 hours a day. They already have contracted, Archer is contracted with Signature and Atlantic, two of the top FBOs, which is fixed base operators at regional airports. So when they land at one of their destination points, they will plug it in while one load of passengers is getting out and another load getting in. It'll charge in about 7 or 8 minutes, like some of the fast cars, and they won't have fast charging cars, and they won't be completely run down. So they'll always keep them charged. The other thing, and I want to segue your comment, Gary, or the concept. We start out with the urban air mobility, and I think we see that in the next 3 to 5 years really coming at us. But that technology, when people experience it going to the airport, I mean, that's why I want one for my driveway. That's why I want one to be able to land in my driveway, park in my garage, and throw in the back of a pickup. So, and that's why I want one for Monday and one for Tuesday. And I'm not going to get that many. My wife won't let me spend that kind of money. But a man can wish, right? But I think, and then the prices on these will start coming down as well. So that that one we talked about, the Jetson One Jetpack, which is one passenger unit, is priced at $98,000. But I can see that coming down. But it weighs in at 190 pounds, so I see that coming down to under 50,000 pretty soon.
So, Rick, you live in Southern California. Do you find this to be an appealing notion?
I think the commute part and the getting out of the traffic part, yes. I might be a little reluctant to get in one if it's not piloted.
Yeah. I've done presentations on all this on autonomous vehicles, and one of the pictures I love showing is a picture of this big biplane from probably around 1929, 1930, and a line of people getting on it. And you look at this plane with our set of eyes and here 2024, and you go, my God, I would never get in a machine like that. Never get it. But people did.
Yeah.
And
That's
air
a good
traffic
analogy.
safety was not what it is today back then. These things crashed. People still got on them. So it's a risk reward thing. It's like, yeah, I kind of feel fear for my life, but oh my gosh, the only way I can get to where I want to go in the time I want to get there is getting on this machine. So there will be early adopters who will say, yep, put me on that autonomous electric flying contraption. And others who are going to say, I'm going to wait and see what happens. And until they see them everywhere for years, those people will not get on.
I do think that, like we were talking about the Olympics, right? So if there's something really visible and people see it in a setting like that, in sort of the context of that event, would probably go a long way to getting people to be intrigued and maybe learning more and maybe feeling better about those safety concerns.
It's going to be, the mother of necessity kind of a thing, right? So, I mean, some of the metro areas that have been cited, especially in Asia, especially like in India, where it may take you 3 hours to get to the airport versus 10 to 15 minutes. It's like, holy moly, man. Yeah, get me on that VTOL, because I'm not going to make my flight if I don't do it.
By the way, and we've covered a lot of ground. One thing that would be important to cover, that Volocopter is the name of the one that will
Germany.
It's
Mercedes
built in
is
Germany, and it's invested in by Mercedes and Airbus. It's supposed to transport competitors at the Olympics. But I'm often asked, why we've got helicopters. Why do we need these? Well, the helicopters are not battery electric, and with that one big prop, it's very disruptive, both in noise and wind. So their claim is 5% of the noise and wind that a helicopter puts out. So that's why they're much more acceptable.
Right.
And you could land them they're so much quieter that your neighbors won't even know you're landing in your driveway.
Well, and it comes down to rotor tip speed.
Yeah.
That's the big noise thing. Plus, helicopters got, big combustion engines in them. But it's
disbursement. It's dispersing it to multiple smaller props versus one big prop.
Right. So if you have multiple props, the props don't have to turn as much. They're not as big. The rotor tip speed is not as great, so they're far quieter. Helicopters require massive amounts of maintenance.
Yeah.
And they're very difficult to manufacture. They're very difficult to fly. So that's why these eVTOLs kill them in that
John,
regard.
but when we have electric cars, there'll be less need for gear making for the transmissions that we have in vehicles right now. So the complexity of helicopters is largely predicated on the gear sets. So there'll be a wealth of people that will be able to maintain these things. It will not be a problem at all.
Maybe you're right, but I'll bet these eVTOLs catch on.
Yeah. Hey, there's another company out of Germany called Lilium, Lilium. Very impressive. And they call it Lilium Jet, but it's not jet fuel, but they use like jet turbines. And so it's a much more attractive unit. And it also claims a lot longer range. They just signed a contract with Urban Link, a provider in South Florida, to do urban air mobility between Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach, and they ordered the first 30 units. I just read an article this morning that Urban Link wants to take that model and take it across the country. They may do it with Lilium or others, but that's the way it will expand, I think.
Cool. Hey, look, we're going to have to wrap this up, but what a great discussion. Tim, thanks so much for... Hold up your book again.
Yeah,
Dude, where's my flying car?
Let's do that.
You can get all the info in there. He's got a whole lot. He's got a history of just about every brand that's ever been in the American market in there as well for cars.
Yeah.
But and Rick, thanks so much for coming on. Very interesting, the intel that you're able to provide these automakers. They got to watch how they spend their marketing money, and that really helps them make it a rifle shot, not a shotgun blast.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Gary, we'll do this again next week.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
First time in this.
Having me.
Thank you all for having tuned in. And hey, if you like this conversation and want to see more of this, be sure that you subscribe to this channel.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.